The chairman probably had a habit of putting out a lot of large agendas. Kelsey knows because she had to sit and listen to us talk every time. But like there were several agendas and several items on every agenda, and a huge part of it was making sure that we're addressing all parts of all the options. And you know, if you did something that one industry cared about, you almost had to do something to make sure the other industry knew that you cared about them too. As a parent of three, I can tell you that parity is very important in parenting. In some ways, you have to think about policymaking from that side too. Man, they're all the same. Industry and children are basically the same. It's amazing. But I think that has to be an approach from policymakers' perspective. That all the above approach, and recognizing that if you're perceived pushing one item over another or one issue or the other, it creates problems. It creates problems down the stack. It creates problems for a lot of policymakers, for civil society and others. And so, I think it's really important in this discussion for people on Capitol Hill, for people at the White House, for people at the FCC to be kind of coming from a balanced approach and recognizing that press releases matter, like statements matter, earnings calls matter, like recognizing that if you're not taking that balanced approach, if you're not enabling all ships to rise, and you're perceived, even if it's not intentional, as benefiting one or the other, it really creates friction down the road. And so I think, like, when I come looking at these conversations, or when I hear whether it's my former boss or the recent chairwoman or the new chairman, like, how are you coming across to make sure that you're enabling policies that allow all above? What's the conversation like in the congressional hearings? How are members answering questions? Are they perceived as pushing one agenda or the other, or are we creating an environment where these conversations are getting to the marketplace and we're not hindering their ability to come to the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, spoken like a true campaign manager, but I think the convergence is good. The more competition, more entrants in the marketplace is good. But I think we need to be clear about a few things. First, when we're talking about cellular and home connections, we're in mobile and wireless, whatever, all of them, some of these things are complementary. And I think that a lot of people talk about them as one can replace the other. But the research has been very clear that most consumers use their connections in complementary ways and want to have both options available. Second, I think it's important to, yes, having, creating an even playing field for all types of providers to enter the marketplace and, be competitive, but that does not necessarily mean that all technologies perform equally, that they all have the same reliability. And when we're thinking in particular about taxpayer dollars, that's something I think can and should do a better job of distinguishing. And that is in many ways emblematic, that we can have that conversation now is emblematic of all the progress that has been made both within technological innovations and the policy standards that have been passed. So yeah, I think that's good from my standpoint.
Yeah, so I did just want to go back to something you were saying, and then I want to let you respond because we want to keep this conversational. First of all, Nathan, I do remember covering the PIE agenda well. We were always getting out well past lunchtime. And I think you also made a great point that it's important to look at both how policymakers are talking about these technologies and also how the market is talking about these technologies and how regular people are engaging with them and what they're finding useful. So yeah, please go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, and I wanted to address something that Catherine was talking about, and that is how consumers engage with the technologies. She was discussing how consumers still are heavily reliant on having a home broadband service that is reliable, that is scalable, right? And we've seen that over time because so many consumers are connecting 20 devices at home and they have multiple users at home. And then yet we still have over 400 million different connections that are mobile, which also indicates, right, you have 122 million households with a fixed connection, and we have over 400 million individual subscribers for the mobile. It indicates that these are very dynamic markets, and it is really important as policymakers to consider how consumers are interacting and what changes are they seeing. So one of the things that I've advocated for at the FCC is that they collect a lot of information from companies, which is fantastic, and from public interest groups, which is also really great, but actually engaging with consumers directly and doing more survey work about what consumers are doing with these new technologies. Do they actually have the choice that I think sometimes the markets like to think that they do? And I think having more of a direct line with consumers and understanding how consumers view their choices and view competition in the various product markets is a really key and important thing for the agencies to be doing.
Definitely. Well, we're going to get into price in a few minutes, but I want to go ahead and address the elephant in the room here. Let's talk about the BEAD program. Congress, as you all know, committed $42 billion to connecting all of the unserved Americans with high-speed internet. But many in the new administration would like to see the program significantly reshaped in some way. I'd love to start with Catherine, actually. Can you tell us what this reshaping might look like and how drastically the program can be reshaped before it starts conflicting with that underlying statute?
I'm not going to speculate on what will happen, but there are a few things that I think folks should know. First, what has been lost in a lot of the public narrative and the coverage of BEAD and DEA too, but is all the work that states have done in partnership with ISPs to reach this moment. First, we have states that are actively running grant rounds right now. They are taking bids from ISPs. They are evaluating how they get to that 100% served, underserved goal. But in order to solicit those grants, they've had to go through years of data collection and cleaning, intensive community and ISP engagement, business planning, what I will call not a light deduplication process to ensure that there's no deduplication of federal funds. There is a significant amount of due diligence that has gotten states exactly to this moment. So for the first time, we can actually feel confident that we can reach that goal, again, of 100% served. Looking ahead, though, I think it's very important for us to think about how we build on that progress and look at opportunities to alleviate some of the barriers to getting shovels in the ground. Should we be looking at things like removing requirements on letters of credit, on looking at past work that has been done on the ARPA broadband programs around things like NEPA, where ISPs are already completing some of these processes so they're familiar with it, they're replicable, and there's something that they can implement quickly. So I think that just knowing and acknowledging all the work that has been done to this moment and that bipartisan, bicameral members are eager to get shovels in the ground, and so is the administration. So how do we really focus on getting those shovels in the ground and quickly?
First, I would say that personnel is policy, and I'm super excited about President Trump's pick to run NTIA. I think Errol Roth is just an excellent example of someone who understands the policy, understands it from Capitol Hill, working at the FCC, working in the administration. She's just been a really excellent partner in a lot of policy conversations. And she's also about being, efficiency and finding the right way of doing forward. The other person that matters a lot of this is now the Senate Majority Leader, in John Thune, who spent a long time talking about wasteful spending and broadband. And now we have a DOGE. And now we have people who actually want to look at the most efficient ways to make sure we're allocating resources. I think I participated in Senator Thune's. He requested for comments on wasteful spending, and he get into a lot of duplicative programs, a lot of, I think 15 different agencies, 120 programs. Like, this is a lot. And trying to make sure we're right sizing it to make sure that we're not overbuilding and making sure that we're getting the dollars to the people, to the spaces that need it, is going to be really important. And leveraging all of the above technologies we just mentioned, making sure that alternative technologies have a spot at the table. But also, and this is important to hear, alternative technologies should not be just one company. when a lot of people think of alternative technologies, they think of Starlink, and God bless them, but like, it can't be the Kleenex to tissue paper. We need more competitive competition in that space. And I'm really excited to see some of the LEO companies, Kuiper and others who are coming to table and actually deploying. I think that speaks to the larger approach that allowing us to right size the technology accordingly. And then as a part of that dialogue, like I read Ted Hearn's newsletter every day. Everyone should be reading Policy Band. It gets the best newsletter, and whatever Kelsey writes too is also very, very good. But like Ted's newsletter is great, and what's been fun over the past couple of days is he's literally writing posts of like different state-based people complaining about how these different technologies would be a problem for them in their state, in like, for example, Alaska. And I'm like, oh, I wonder where that came from. And it's just kind of like interesting to see. I'm glad that he's reporting it because it's showing that every state's different. Every state has different interests, and every state has to be, Louisiana, Delaware are very different than Alaska, and kind of recognizing that and kind of where they're coming at these conversations. So I'm kind of curious to kind of see how that plays out, because that's a trick also for thinking about BEAD is, on paper you might want to say, let's reform, let's think about all these options, be efficient with the money, but also you run into the reality of different people who aren't always on the same page with that.
Look, Catherine's point is well taken that states are finally reached a moment, but it took forever to get here. And in the meantime, the last administration adopted policies that this administration, I believe, is going to put in the garbage. Most of BEAD, all the extra policy add-ons, the union pieces, they're going into the garbage, is my opinion. And then the question is, what do you do with fiber preference? And there's going to be a hard push from some to dump that too. I don't know how that turns out, and there's definitely fans of dumping it, and will have a large voice in this administration. So I think BEAD is going to go through a significant review. It's not something, they can be ready to submit their material and take all the bids they want and then send them to NTIA. I don't think NTIA is going to process anything in the near term. I think they're going to figure out where they want to go beforehand. And the states better be ready to change, and move off some of the positions they've been in. So I think we're going to see a significant rewrite of BEAD in some form or fashion. I just don't know what happens with the fiber preference. I think it violates the statute. But then the question is, and I've written about this recently, do you want to spend some time in court on that? If you look at what's happening in DC these days, I think the administration's saying, hey, well, we're going to play this out. We're not for the timid and the weak. We're going to do what we think is right. And so I think all of these things are going to be examined, and BEAD's going to look a little different than what people thought it would. Blame the Biden administration if you want. You can't spend 4 years building a program that goes nowhere. And that's where we are. Sure.
I think it's important, though. I agree with you. We would have liked to have seen shovels in the ground.
I would have liked to. Come on. These are people who haven't had service ever in their life.
Commissioner, what I am saying is that there's a reason why Congress put all of these requirements in statute. And that has been documented by Senator Cruz, the GAO, in several reports, as well as other members of Congress. And that's because there are significant flaws with federal broadband policy, not just the structure of funding, not just the definition of broadband, but how we approach things like permitting, like workforce. I'm not saying that every step that the Biden administration took was correct or should be continued moving forward, but it has taken this long to get to this moment because Congress asked states and NTIA and other federal partners to use this time to clarify and, quite frankly, fix some pretty significant flaws that have stood in the way of deployment and effective use of funds for the last several years.
I'd love them to do certain things. They haven't done much on pull attachments. I'd love for them to revisit some of those things. So,
States have.
Not many, not enough.
You want me to?
Angie, you got anything to
I
say
can
on
try
that?
to play cleanup just a little bit. Sure.
No, this is fun. Let's lean into it.
So I think it's important to take a step back and look at where we've been and where we're going. And this is part of the issue with when you invite someone on the panel who's been around for 30 years. So back during the National Broadband Plan, the woman who wrote the chapter on universal service is actually sitting in the audience, and that's Carol Maddie. one of the things that she noted was, hello, Congress, if you really want us to connect everyone to broadband, the USF cannot do it by itself. We actually need you to give us a significant grant in order for us to connect everyone. And it took COVID, a 100-year pandemic, to really wake up Congress, for them to realize, oh, you know what? You're right about this. We do need to make this significant investment. And it was bipartisan legislation. And during that process, what we learned is that there had been kind of a loss of trust in the FCC, and they really wanted the states to be involved in solving this problem. And that's really what Catherine is referring to. So it's a much more complex situation now, because you have every state, from the governor's office to the broadband office to the legislature, right, that have something at stake now. And so I do think there's so much complexity about how we'll see how the politics play out and what may change of some of the requirements. But I think it is really key to keep our eye on the prize. And that is, when Congress was negotiating the BEAD project, the program, they knew that the United States was behind, drastically behind. When you look at what other countries are doing and the investments that they're making in fiber technology that feeds every other technology, from wireless to satellite, we knew that we needed to encourage as much fiber out there as possible. At the same time, though, the Congress knew they weren't going to be able to get fiber to every single home. That would just be way too expensive. So they did leave the flexibility that's needed to still connect everyone. We still need that balance. We need the balance of recognizing the need for efficiencies, but we also need to recognize where we are as a nation, in that we cannot be behind the rest of the world. We do need to get the connectivity out there as quickly as possible, and it needs to be scalable technology. This is a one-time investment. We are never going to get this kind of money out of Congress again. So let's be smart about it, and then let's get it done. And I'm a firm believer in doing pole attachment reform. That could be a whole nother panel, but none of you would show up to talk about it. We need to look at pole attachments, permitting, building access. Like, how do we ensure that these new technologies, that these new services that are coming in because they're supported by government subsidies, can get into the hands of consumers as quickly as possible?
Well, I don't want to spend too much longer on this topic, because obviously BEAD is just one corner of this universe of broadband funding and competition. But I do want to spend a couple more minutes on this, because like you're saying, like, a lot of things have changed in the last couple of years as BEAD has gotten stood up. And I think one of those things is satellite. So I do want to just see if anyone wants to weigh in on whether satellite has gotten more reliable in the years since BEAD was first stood up. You know, are we looking at a different competitive landscape now than we were 2 or 3 years ago? And does that mean that satellite should be able to play a bigger role?
I'll get to the satellite in a second, but I would say, just because there's a large pile of money being deployed or offered by Congress doesn't mean you have to accept all the bad policies that come with it. And I think a good point that the commissioner is raising is that, there's a lot of resources because of Congress have made it available, but it has to be implemented in a way that doesn't create barnacles that then keep us from doing it the right way down the road. You can't give an alcoholic a drink because then they keep on drinking and then there's a problem. I think in the same way with states in the way that they're implementing, and these state broadband offices are implementing, they have to make, there have to be better policies down the road that allow us to make sure that we're not enabling, bad deployment practices. And I think that's an ongoing conversation. It's not just to BEAD, but it goes across the board. And I think that's why it's good to debate it and discuss it. On satellite, it is a very exciting technology. Every time I go camping now with family up in northern Michigan, you'll see at the RV parks, the dozens of these little things popping out, and people are like, oh, this is cool, now you go camping long term, this is great. But like, it has to be more than just going camping. And I think that's like what's exciting about these two new technologies, whether it's satellite, whether it's the next generation Wi-Fi, whether it's, you know, the new deployments in the wireless space. Like, there's a lot of opportunity across the board that is making technology better and more accessible. What I think is very important is, how is this allowing communities to participate in the next generation AI and the workforce and whatnot. And so, you know, I think it is very clear that we were seeing some major changes even from whenever Mike and I were at the commission to now. It's really exciting. But, you know, again, it kind of goes back to this kind of all of the above approach. Like, are we creating an environment that's allowing, you know, one to go over the other, but allowing all ships to rise?
Anybody else want to address that? Otherwise, we'll move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the satellite's always been part of the picture. It will always need to be part of the picture. I think that there's some, there should be some discussion about the way that that preferencing was treated. But I mean, what we've heard consistently from governors, state legislators, in addition to the offices, is that they want that investment in fiber in particular because of all of the stuff that actually everybody's talked about. We're talking about AI, national security, you know, just building out a more resilient infrastructure, and also one that can support the deployment of alternative technologies. They're eager for that, but they also know that right now they don't have the fiber in place to facilitate that. I've got a lot of feelings on middle mile too, but that's not what this is for. So I think, though, it's important to note as well, and where states have also highlighted where they want to be able to use LEO, I think that they might enjoy some flexibility in being able to just say, hey, there are certain locations where we should just say, this is where LEO should be connected. But there have also been several states that have launched pilot programs for satellite. That's Maine, that's Texas, South Carolina. Virginia is building on some lessons from pilot programs on mesh technology and just general wireless and densely populated areas that they did with ARPA funds. So there is a lot of that, you know, innovation happening. And the more, as we see more information from these state plans coming forward, I mean, they're all technically out there, but they're just not finally approved. We are going to learn more about how states have approached this, and also the cost differential between these different types of technologies by location.
So that actually leads me perfectly into my next question, which is around broadband price. And I think BEAD is a great example of this, you know, to talk about this broader theme. BEAD actually says that every state needs to have a low-cost broadband option, but now some of the states are moving to, you know, change those requirements or challenging a $15 maximum price. What role does price play in consumer accessibility, and how do we need to maybe change our thinking about that being a barrier in 2025?
I mean, price is still the leading barrier to adoption, and that's not just the cost of a subscription, it's also the devices that come along with it. ACP going away is one of the biggest risks that states are still figuring out what to do. ISPs are still figuring out what to do, but ACP going away is put a huge question mark on top of BEAD and, quite frankly, the viability of these networks in the long term. We need internet service providers at the table. We also need to recognize that these are high-cost locations. So we are looking at the capital costs. We need to be thinking about those operational costs. But actually, Commissioner, you said some stuff at a Pew event about a year ago on some of this, and particularly ACP as it relates to deployment, and how we need to be thinking differently about the business case moving forward. So I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I have supported ACP because it's about finding price support for those families that actually need it. I think it was too generous, and you know, there were forms that people weren't willing to make, and the program expired because of some of those things. So there were problems in the policymaking side, but I think the premise of addressing affordability is proper, because you're only trying to subsidize those families that actually need it. In terms of price overall, I'm opposed to, and have written about this extensively, we're going to object to price regulation. So I don't expect you're going to see that from this administration. I think you're going to see them doing just the opposite. So you're not going to see them regulating prices on the front. The question is, can we find some way to subsidize those families that absolutely need it when the economics turn against them. So I'm in favor of doing that, but it has to be a program that can be sustainable and one that can be garnered support from a lot of different individuals.
I just want to flag for the audience that, it's important to recognize where we are with respect to the jurisdiction over broadband. And because of the most recent Sixth Circuit decision that the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction as broadband as a Title II service, this thing gives room for states to potentially regulate in this area. And we've seen some states who've already implemented affordability requirements. And I think we likely could see other states do the same thing, which then will raise questions likely for the current FCC. I imagine that there will be ISPs who are going to be seeking preemption by the FCC, and we'll then see legal challenges to that. So this is a problem for consumers, but yet here in DC, there will be potentially action going on related to it. I would just urge people, let's listen to the people and what it is that they really need. And let's look more closely at what happened after the ACP. So I think there's room here potentially to find solutions, and certainly a federal solution would be preferred, because we do need to make sure consumers can get connected. Why would we spend all this money building networks if people can't afford it? So let's really tackle that issue and tackle it together in a way that is politically and legally sustainable.
Great. Well, I'd like to move on to talking a little bit more about Congress. A lot of this goes back to the statute. So, Mike, I'd like to start with you. What changes would you like to see Congress make to the 1996 Telecom Act to respond to some of these changing conditions? And relatedly, do you think there are changes the FCC should be making to respond to some of these conditions?
Well, look, I think that there are definitely things I'd like to see the Congress address, but I don't actually think it's quite possible. We have really thin majorities in both the House and in the Senate. So I'm not optimistic they're going to legislate on dramatic changes to the 96 Act. I don't think you're going to see net neutrality statute be enacted anytime soon. I don't think you're going to see the revision of ACP anytime soon. They're focused on other things right at the moment. I just don't see those being top of the priority. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be, but it's just not in the cards, in my opinion. There are definitely a laundry list of things I would do, and will recommend that the Congress tries to provide some relief. But massive reform here is probably unlikely. Things like preemption has to be in the cards, in my opinion. But I don't think that's going to be a trade-off for rate regulation. So there are things that you could do that would fit, but I just think it's a hard sell right at the moment.
I would agree with that. I do think that federal preemption has to be a part of the conversation. I also think the one thing I'm paying attention to most is the conversation around USF, future of USF, in the working group there. It's a very interesting space where you're having a bipartisan conversation with a lot of interesting ideas that are at play, and I think that's actually where I would say a lot of opportunity could come from to kind of see some long-term changes. But like the commissioner, I don't know that we're going to see. I think 1996 Act probably will survive its 30th brand anniversary and not see any changes before then.
But Nathan's right on USF. There is going to need to be some aspect of universal service, and I've been calling it a patch. And it is the immediate issue, what happens with the Supreme Court's review of this. And I've been working with some folks to try and figure out how do we address that. That sets aside all the bigger issues. How do you deal with distribution? How do you deal with contribution? And all the bigger issues that are out there, it sets those aside for another day, because that's not something you can resolve. As someone who's worked on USF, probably just as long as Carol, and with different viewpoints necessarily, it's not something you can resolve in a 2-year window, in my opinion.
Well, I want to go to you, Nathan, to talk about telecom workforce issues now. Broadband obviously doesn't install itself. It's very labor intensive, it's capital intensive, it requires lots of boots on the ground. So what are some of the telecom workforce issues that are constraining the growth of the industry right now, and what can we do to address that?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is you need to start paying more attention to the people who are laying fiber and building towers. And there's two ways to do that. I'm gonna give a shout out to the team at NCTA with their Every Last Mile documentary, which is a really neat way to see what it's really like on the ground, and in some cases below the ground. And then also there's my friends at Nate. Yes, it's hilarious, Nathan talking about Nate, I get it. But they put out a documentary a couple years ago called Vertical Freedom, which is about looking at the stories of those tower climbers who are building and deploying cell phone towers. I have gone up 300 feet, not bad. 1,200 feet less than Brendan Carr has done. He's done 1,500. Congratulations to him. He wins. But anyway, I spend a lot of time actually working with these men and women who are really actually have dirt under their nails and wear work boots and are actually doing what's needed to deploy. And there's a number of different things that need to be changed. First, I would say everything from the OSHA heat rule is a disaster for tower climbers, because basically the heat rule requires you to spend a certain amount of time in the shade. The problem is if you're up a tower, you then have to climb back down just to go back out, and then things like that. The other thing is even the way that we write rules, like the digital discrimination order had lines specifically covering entities, including tower climbers. And I don't know how a tower climber or a fiber linesman actually is perpetuating disparate impact. I just don't understand how they're doing that. They're just building the tower. It's like holding the roofer accountable for people in the house. Those type of things, they have long-term effects. I didn't know until I started working with these guys that it takes 16 months to get a bucket truck to deploy. That's insane. That's because of some international thing, trade stuff. Those are the type of things that hinder their ability to deploy. At the same time, there's actually some ways in which companies could, I think, go about things differently with these tower climbers and other contractors that I worked with and the linesmen. For example, some of these guys don't get paid for 6 months or a year afterwards. And it is really hard when you have a crew of 4 or 5 people or 7 people to be able to do that. Chairman Carr had a really good comment at a policy forum that we had hosted last month, where he specifically said we need to do more to make sure that they're able to do their job and being paid, and actually the wages make sense, because these wages haven't really changed in 5-10 years, and with all the inflation and everything else, they're still affected by it. There's also kind of interesting rules where basically you have to abide. Certain people abide by certain standards for safety, and others are not. And that means the people who are not abiding by the safety are able to undercut prices. All these interesting dynamics, and taking time to actually focus on these hyper-local issues are really actually going to be a long-term thing that I'm paying attention to. The tower climbers, I think, are 1,100 small businesses, or 5 to 10 employees. The linesmen are, I think, 1,300, and they're smaller companies. These are small players at the end of the rope, and I think at the end of the table, I think it's really important for our conversations to be thinking about how they're deploying, what's inhibiting their ability to deploy, how does NEPA play into that, how does permitting reforms long term, what's going on in the city if they're making this determination that you can't deploy here in this way, and these rules. It's one of the reasons preemption rules I'm interested in, because it hinders their ability to deploy. I'm just learning more and more about how a lot of the decisions we're making are applying to them in ways, and it's a dynamic that I think needs to be heard more. And I think in this age with President Trump, and with a lot of conversations about those on the kind of Republican circles talk about that kind of blue collar worker that are usually not thought of in Republican conversations, I'm hopeful this creates an opportunity to kind of talk about those issues. And that's one of the reasons I want to kind of raise it here. So
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to get in on the workforce conversation?
Yeah, just plus one to a lot of that. We're doing research right now on the telecommunications workforce and some of the effects that may or may not happen with BEAD. And there have been some interesting things very similar to what Nathan just lined out coming out of that research. I think on the competition point, we know that there is going to be interstate competition competing for the same workers across state lines. And then there are also industries that are competing for the same labor force. Energy is the one that most often comes up, particularly when we're talking about small providers. Both of those factors could have an increase. They influence competition, but they also influence the ultimate cost of deployment. I also wanted to share just some numbers with you, Continuum Capital released a report that there will be 28,000 new construction jobs required to build out these networks between 2025 and 2032, as well as 30,000 new technician jobs for that same time period. So again, that's 28,000 new construction jobs, 30,000 new technician jobs. We need to figure out a way to fill these roles. And they're careers, they're not just jobs. One thing that we haven't talked about in this conversation related to BEAD is the use of non-deployment funds. And many states are planning to use non-deployment dollars, if they have them, to help address some of these workforce shortages. So they're working with internet service providers, community colleges, workforce development boards to stand up apprenticeship programs, pipelining programs. Montana actually has one that's active now. So as we think about kind of what BEAD looks like moving forward and some of the interventions that are needed, workforce is certainly one of those things that we'd like to see some progress on.
One more plug. If you're interested in visiting some of those community colleges to learn about their program, you should talk to either of us, I'm sure. But also, if you want to like dig, check it out yourself. Let me know. I'm happy to connect you with some people who can help you dig. And if you are crazy enough to go climb one, I'm happy to get you a climb.
Can't believe you just offered.
I've already put in my plug.
all in.
You're gonna have
We'll
like
go.
60
We love it.
people emailing.
Well, actually, to be fair, we hosted a tower climb for Hill staffers earlier this year, and I was surprised I had like 20 Hill staffers who were like excited to climb 75 feet in the air and learn about this. But like, my point is like, get out of here. Like, go out. I love saying that. I'm not trying to leave the conference, but like after the snowstorm and stuff, find ways to see like what this infrastructure looks like, how they're being deployed, how it's connected to the community. And I think that's just like whether it's digging or going above, like there can be great job opportunities, and there should be good workforce programs. Also, like we need to realize some of the downstream effects of decisions or lack of decisions that are here really hinder their ability, because there could be an opening and shortage of jobs, but that could go away in 2 or 3 years if a funding program goes out. Yep. And that's like the thing that needs to be more continuity for these companies. A friend of mine, he had to close his company up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, like literally last week, because of kind of the inconsistency in the workforce. It's a hardship for the 4 or 5 guys in that team. And that's just happening everywhere if we're not being more consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think your point about this policy versus real world disconnect is well taken, because it's very easy to get in DC policy circles. We're talking about these ideas and not looking at how it, affects real people. So speaking of disconnects, Angie, I want to turn to you to talk about USF reform and what needs to happen there. What are we going to be seeing in the next year? And how can, especially the Congressional Working Group, maybe address some of these disconnects in the way that funding is collected and dispersed?
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. I would just reiterate some of the points that Mike has already made. We have a Supreme Court decision that will happen before the end of this term that's going to be looking at essentially the constitutionality of the USF. So potentially, you may need Congress to intervene to address any of the issues that could come out of that decision. So stay tuned for that. I agree that it's unlikely to see the working group produce anything publicly until that court decision occurs. And what we know about their work is that there was a lot of focus on it, looking at the low-income issue, affordability of broadband, and also looking at contribution reform. I think that it's key for the working group to take a broader look at something that Nathan mentioned. We have a lot of funding that has been happening for broadband, a lot of different programs. So where is there overlap? Where do we need streamlining? Where are programs that potentially it's time for them to wind down? And that potentially is funding that could be used for ensuring that low-income families have affordable service, right, by subsidizing them directly. So I think that it's important for this working group to assess where we are right now. And that is, we know that there's a lot of focus by the new administration on efficiencies. And there are some things that they can do. I also think there are things that the agencies with jurisdiction over various programs can do to look for efficiencies as well. So it would encourage that look in addition. So those are my thoughts, but welcome anybody else's perspective on USF.
My only take on USF, and I've been working on this for a long time, is that you can't just do one piece. You can't just do contribution reform. You've got to look at distribution. To Angie and to Nathan's point, there are a lot of programs out there that need to be reformed and combined. So distribution has to be part of it. And then administration, which maybe we deal with as part of the patch, but that doesn't solve the bigger issue on administration. So all those pieces have to come together, and that requires time and difficulty, and has been proven to be one of the hardest issues in communication policy to solve.
Could I, controversial perspective, let the USF working group do whatever it's going to do, but we've all sat up here and talked about other ways to chip at fairly significant issues with federal broadband policy, permitting, poll attachments, labor. We haven't even talked about digital skills and how the absence of that, what that will do to our economy in the long term. There are other ways, and we need to remember that there are other ways that we can chip away at the challenges that we're facing right now without tackling the behemoth, well, while others maybe tackle the behemoth that is USF.
Great. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. If we want to turn this to the audience, I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm sure we've got folks watching on the live stream too. Does anyone want to ask any questions to our panelists while we have them here? I see one right there. And we've got a microphone coming.
Raise your hand again. Is there a question?
Hey, I'm Nat Purser with Public Knowledge. I wanted to ask how changing the mix of technologies, so giving a little bit more to fixed wireless and LEOs under BEAD, if it gets reconfigured, how that could shape the broadband affordability conversation, because we know that Starlink is cheaper to deploy. That's great. It's still $100 to $120 a month for most consumers. That's like the average subscription price. So can you talk about how changing the configuration of technologies could enhance bipartisan support for a tech-neutral voucher like the ACP or through a revised USF, just to create a stable base of demand where those new networks are being built?
I think you're looking at me. Sure.
Everybody.
Sure. I'll start and then people jump in. Okay, I don't know if they're going to change the current structure. I said that's the toughest nut to crack. I think there's the policy issues, and then you have what do you do with the BEAD demarcation line. I think it's going to change, but we'll just have to see what it does. I favor an ACP type structure because it's exactly what Angie mentioned before. I wrote an op-ed about this, that if we don't deal with affordability on the front end, we're going to deal with it on the back end. And so what I like about ACP is that you target just those households, because right now under subsidy programs, we're subsidizing a lot of households that don't make any sense. And don't need the support. And that's problematic. So when you're talking about costs, though, you're asking the costs on satellite compared to others. There are long-term costs, and we make it seem like that one technology can be cheaper if we just throw these billions at it. But then if you talk to the companies, they'll say, oh, but we need operational support later on. You're going to give us operational support later on, aren't you? It's like, we weren't planning on it. Well, you're going to need to do that. That's got to be factored as part of the equation. So you can't just say one technology is more expensive if you're not doing a complete comparison.
I'm Drew Garner with the Benton Institute. You had mentioned that a lot of these BEAD areas are only probably going to be accessible because of the government subsidy to build the networks. Without a low-cost requirement and without competition, how do we ensure that people can actually afford to take advantage of these giant public investments?
Again, I think you're looking at me, and I'll answer your question. Anyone? Sure. To your point in terms of competition, I don't think we're going to have multiple. The grant programs haven't been set up to have multiple providers within a market. So there's going to be one winner, right, in most instances. And the question is, how do you make sure that the families within that area can afford it? I favored an ACP to try and do that. It doesn't exist, so I don't know how you exactly deal with that, and that's what we're going to fight over in the next couple of months or a couple of years. And as long as it takes for the BEAD dollars to go out, I don't know how long it's going to take for that to go out. But I think you're going to see reform to the last structure, and we're going to see what that means and to let the dust settle. And I don't know how you deal with the affordability issue without some type of ACP. But I also see a problem with states setting up their own ACP. So there are a lot of policy issues, and I know we're in DC. I've traveled to those states and over my time, and I've been there and tried to figure out. I've sat at kitchen tables when people are like, "I can't afford it. I've dumped this, but I can't afford it." I get all of those things, and that's kind of what's made me land where I am. But they're not easy issues. They're not easy answers. Going forward, there is a mechanism to just say, okay, it's going to be very low cost. It's not in the cards.
So you don't see a requirement, the low cost requirement in these monopoly.
There is a low cost requirement in BEAD, so that's statutory. Well, I'm not saying we should, Steve, that's this Congress to decide. I used to work there, and that was when I got to make some of the decisions. I don't. They put it in the statute that people can change it, and they can reform it to how they see fit. The administration will have an opportunity to implement it. I don't believe in rate regulation as part of that, but it is in the words.
Great. Do we have any more audience questions? We've got one here in the front.
Hi. So I was wondering, something that was being thrown around this conversation is some households don't, I guess not need, but that they shouldn't qualify for these low cost initiatives. So I kind of wanted to know, can you clarify on what a household that does not need these services would look like?
Look, I used to run some of these programs, so I'm happy to go through that. But the issue fundamentally is when someone says that ACP can cover 45% of America, that's too broad. That's not sustainable. We burn through the dollars too quickly. If you want to put a partisan hat on it, I think that when I talked to people on the Hill, they thought the number for Republicans was between 5 and 10%. That was the households that they were willing to support. 45% of America, not in the cards, and that's why you had such a disconnect. I went and tried to sell ACP. We did the meetings. It was not fun to try and convince Republicans when they say 45% of America is eligible. Not a chance I'm ever going to be for that. It's hard. So there were reforms that were put forward, lots of reforms that were, and I endorsed a lot of the reforms. Not everyone did, and I said, hey, if we don't, we're going to be in a problem.
Yeah, I jump on that too. Like, there were a lot of stories that were really easy to cherry pick and so say, look at this family, they're actually making way more above the poverty line, and they're here. So like those stories, especially in the Doge era that we're in, like it has to be above reproach. It has to be like we're targeting this to those who are actually really in need and making sure. And I think that conversation coming out of COVID has also changed, where there's also this idea of like in 2020, 2021, I think the environment was a little different. And I think that thinking about that long term and realizing, okay, what is that? Maybe it's 15% of America, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 20, like, figure out what that is. I'm sure we could actually have a larger debate about what that number should actually be. And maybe it's different in New York versus Louisiana. I don't know, probably. But like, that's also, I think, a part of that conversation. But, what became really hard was being able to talk about what reforms were acceptable, because a lot of times when we were looking for, I think the commissioner was really leading on this, is looking for pragmatic solutions. We would be pilloried on the other side of being like, you're just trying to hand off government money to everyone else. So it's like, really, we're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And like, it really was that kind of environment. And so I think that's important for people to really think about this pragmatically, and be like, okay, what really can we do here, especially in like a Doge era that we live in?
There is a current standard that's being used for the Lifeline program, which is part of the Universal Service Fund. That's been a long-standing standard for affordability for low-income families. So you may want to look at that. I know that's something that's been of interest as part of the potential for bringing ACP into USF or through some kind of funding mechanism that I know the Hill staff has been also considering, and what that means in terms of the number of families that that would be qualifying under that standard. So I'd point you to that. The second thing that I think it's maybe useful to you in your understanding of this is to look at the FCC's most recent communications marketplace report. There, they were discussing what is considered affordable service and kind of looking at a broad view of the economy and how much money a family should be spending on broadband. And they had some information in there about what it looks like on a state or regional basis. Just, they didn't make any determinations. It was more just trying to get the facts out. But I think that it would be useful for you to take a look at that as well.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time. I'm sure all of us would love to continue these conversations online, so please say hi, and let's just keep talking about these things. Thank you for being here, and thanks for your attention.
Wants to grab a seat if you have any seats left over, and we will get started. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here this morning. My name is Maggie Miller. I'm a cybersecurity reporter for Politico, and I'm very happy to be moderating a session this morning on geopolitics of the internet. How will Trump reframe the new world order? So if you were hoping to be in one of the other sessions that's happening right now, you're in the wrong room, so you can exit pretty quickly. Alongside me today, we have some great panelists. They include Ari Schwartz, the Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services at Venable. Then we have Jim Lewis, the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Milton Mueller, Professor of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. Thanks for making the trip up here. And Luke Hogg, the Director of Technology at the Foundation for American Innovation. Thanks so much all for being here today. All right, so we're going to kick off the session today with a conversation around everyone's favorite or least favorite app, TikTok. So when President Trump entered office last month, he signed an executive order that delayed TikTok's being banned in the U.S. due to lack of being sold by ByteDance for 75 days. So I'm interested to hear from our panelists your thoughts on what this means in terms of the future of TikTok in the U.S. and also, you know, the operation of Chinese-owned apps in the U.S. As the Trump administration kicks off. And happy to start with you, Luke, since you're right next to me.
Well, I think I have a very strong opinion on TikTok. The first thing that we ever wrote at the Foundation for American Innovation on the issue of TikTok was in 2020. So I've been working on the issue of TikTok in the United States for a long time. And I think, obviously, from the perspective of somebody who has worked and educated to try and promote the ban and has supported the ban, the delay and the what President Trump has done is not ideal. I would have liked to see. I would prefer to not have this delay. However, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think ultimately President Trump is willing. Ultimately, the goal of everybody is we want TikTok to stay in the United States, but we also want it to be secure. And so, if the delay is what's necessary in order to actually get a sale and to secure TikTok in that way, then that's what it takes. I mean, obviously the litigation went for so long that I believe by the end of the Supreme Court case, they would have only had something like 10 days in order to sell a multi-billion-dollar platform. So if it takes 75 days and then at the end of that 75 days, it's either sold or it's either sold or banned, then that's the devil's in the details there. I think that's a perfectly fine solution. But I do think it's important to note that, the reason that this sale hasn't gone through, one of the big reasons that that TikTok has fought against this legislation so strongly is, ultimately it's up to the CCP. I mean, if you even go and watch their oral arguments in the Supreme Court, they're very clear that the ultimate reason that they haven't sold yet is because the CCP won't let them and doesn't want them to. And so I think that ultimately at the end of the 75 days, we're going to see a ban.
Milton, do you have any thoughts?
Many thoughts, yes. By the way, is there an echo here? Can you hear me okay? Because I'm really getting an echo over here. Okay, good. So you really have to put this in the broader context. It's not really about TikTok per se. It is about free trade in information technology and whether that free trade also includes China, right? So in effect, the US spent 30 years from the 80s to the present day, or maybe 10 years ago, creating a global regime for free trade in information technology and information services and telecommunications. And suddenly, because of panic about China, we are deciding that any form of interaction with China, any form of digital interaction, any form of communication, any form of information service is a national security threat, right? Now, one of the problems with this whole narrative is that the notion of a threat, there is no threat model behind these threats. It's just, it's China, it's dangerous, right? There's no plausible scenario in which you can show me that the possession of TikTok on 1 million American phones is actually something that can threaten the security of the entire United States or our governments. That's just not a plausible case, and we've debunked that repeatedly. And so the bigger problem here is you ask, what are the implications for other apps? The implications are dire. The Supreme Court fortunately said that the sort of covert content manipulation rationale for the ban was off the table because it's a First Amendment violation, right? They can't do that. But they said, oh, the data thing is the real threat, okay? So again, the court has no real idea how the exchange of data, which is involved in every digital service, every internet service, every internet access provider is exchanging data with other countries around the world, including China. So if data exchanges are per se a national security threat, then every Chinese app, Temu, you name it, it's a national security threat. And I think this is almost a reductio ad absurdum. It's like, it's clearly not true to say that, because I bought a dog hut from Temu and they know something about what I buy, that this is something that threatens the United States of America. I just haven't seen anybody make that case. So we really have to decide whether we want an internet, whether we want an open and free digital ecosystem, or do we want to go back to digital isolationism in which we try to wall off countries, sort of like we used to do in the 60s and 70s when we had national telecom monopolies and we had no trade in broadcasting services.
Ari, Jim?
I'll just
No, Ari.
say very briefly.
Oh, no, please. Take your time.
Okay. On this topic, that I think right now, the phone ecosystem that we have is very secure. There's lots of reasons for that. But that is not always going to be the case, right? And the fact, we've even seen in Europe where they've, there's this big push on the opening up the marketplaces, trying to getting competition issues, that we've seen security issues come with the apps that they're allowing in there, et cetera, in ways that Google and Apple now cannot be the gatekeepers to protect for security anymore. So I do think that there is kind of the ongoing long-term picture that you have on apps and security of apps that we have to take into account here. And I think that's, I think it's a combination of both the kind of like fear of what can happen down the road, and also like just a general fear of the Chinese infiltrating the marketplace. It's both of those things at the same time.
TikTok has been loads of fun. I'll miss it when it's gone. For example, all those people who switch to what they call it, Red Note.
Yeah.
They were mistranslating it. It's actually
Little
Little
Red
Red Book, which is a reference to Mao's theme. People didn't even know that. Is kind of pathetic. You then had the CEO of TikTok, at least the American TikTok, saying that they were defending freedom of speech in America. I thought that was hilarious too. A Chinese company headquartered in Beijing is defending freedom of speech. Run that one by me again. So it's been a very silly argument all along. But the key thing to watch is the Chinese Foreign Ministry put out a statement at this point about a month ago where they said, you know what, let the market take its course, let the companies work it out. The Chinese Foreign Ministry does not make statements about like that without sign off from the highest level, right? So what they're signaling is we're open to a deal, we're open to a sale. Will people be able to come up with the money? Will you be able to come up with a governance structure that actually addresses some of the concerns? You know, the way intelligence works now is big data, right? So you hoover up tons of information. Chinese are a little paranoid. They hoover up as much as they can. Whether they can make use of it is another matter, but it's a question of whether you want to accept that risk. So I'm not worried about content. I mean, I watch a lot of TikTok for purely research purposes, and I have never yet felt the desire to burst into the Chinese national anthem after watching it for 3 minutes or so. So forget the content stuff. The data stuff is a concern. There's also a reciprocity issue. TikTok can operate in the US. American companies can't operate in China, right? American social media companies. So we'll see what happens. There's a looming constitutional crisis. I think there's ways to avoid it, right? Because the bill says, you know, you have to get rid of it. And if we don't do that, you'll have a problem. I think there's solutions though, and there's certainly people queuing up. It's worth a lot of money, and that's been one of the, I've talked to a couple of the potential buyers, and they're trying to figure out if it's worth the price. The algorithm isn't a big deal anymore. A long time ago, TikTok's algorithm was special, gave it an advantage. People call it sticky because people watched it more. That, of course, freaked out the other American social media companies who've done their best to copy it. The algorithm is the advantage anymore. It's the user base, it's the customer base, and that's what people want to buy. You'll note that was built into the law, right? So we'll see. I think a deal probably will look like transfer of ownership to some more American flavored board. It's already pretty heavily American. Controls similar to Project Texas. The problem with Project Texas was it was TikTok policing itself. Oddly enough, that didn't strike confidence in a lot of people. So you'll get some blend, but I think a deal, you know, at the end of the 90-day period is probably the best outcome, or the most likely outcome as well.
And that's interesting. Luke and Jim, you've kind of given your take on how this is all going to end. Milton, Ari, how do you think initially at the end of 75 days, this is going to go for TikTok? Are we going to have TikTok in this country, or is it going to disappear?
I think it's going to stay. I think the Trump administration will make some kind of a deal. I do not think there's going to be a sale of the sort contemplated by the bill. It's also possible the bill could be repealed, or the president could declare, you know, that it's not an adversary or some sleight of hand like that. I think we have to respond to Jim a bit. This idea that every Chinese company is a state actor, again, that is completely inconsistent with a global free trade regime. If we say, despite any evidence, you know, it's not headquartered in Beijing. TikTok US is headquartered in Singapore, TikTok Global. And yeah, ha, ha, ha. But what does that mean exactly? That means that an entrepreneur in China cannot globalize their markets. And everything they do is completely under control of the Chinese state. So isn't that the same thing that the Chinese believe about Google and Meta, with equal numbers of justifications? So if we have that attitude, again, we are back to a nationalistic, we are abandoning free trade, and we are not allowing competition in our markets. Who says that competition cannot come from a Chinese company? Didn't we just learn that again with DeepSeek? So I don't see where you know, I think everybody realizes now that the law was a mistake and that it was a panic. And we're going to try to find some way to get out from under it because it's an absurd thing.
Ari or Jim, do you have a response?
Go ahead, Ari, no.
He was talking to you directly.
Yeah, but they asked you to, please, after you, Alphonse.
I'll just say that I think that there will be some solution that will keep TikTok in the United States. I do not know exactly what it will be, but I feel very confident. The president has said that he wants to keep TikTok. I don't think that there's that many people that are out there saying they want TikTok to go away. There's just concern about it being in the hands that it's in. So.
Yeah, no, TikTok will still be here. It will be in a different governance structure, right? But that's not an impossible deal. The larger issue is this question of free trade with China, because frankly, the Chinese cheat, right? Just having been following them out do you realize it's been 29 years since the first case I investigated of Chinese espionage? Amazing, right? They continue to cheat. So we're going to have to work out some deal, but TikTok will not be the victim. I wouldn't mind. They've been so annoying. I wouldn't mind if they were the victim, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, sticking with China, given that this is a geopolitical focused panel, really the first company that came up on the radar on Capitol Hill around this issue was Huawei in terms of concerns of U.S. and allied partner use of Chinese-made technology. And recently in the NDAA, there was another $3 billion included for the Rip and Replace program to help smaller telecom groups in the U.S. rip out Huawei and other potentially security issues, equipment from U.S. telecom networks. So do you think this is enough to fully move Huawei out of our telecom systems? And what is the threat from Huawei at this point after, 6-7 years of U.S. action against the company? For whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll start. I just finished, but Huawei remains an agent of the Chinese government. The nice thing about signals intelligence is it's passive. You don't know what's happening to you. We have fairly good evidence from a number of other countries, not just us, that Huawei collects information at the behest of the Chinese state. Okay, so what else is new? The dilemma for the U.S. is, despite our valiant efforts over the last 2 administrations, Huawei is now the globally dominant telecom market. And so when you go to large parts of Europe, when you go certainly to Africa, increasingly in South America. So we have a different problem than we had. Huawei has won the battle. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, I think we need to be clear that these are real threats. And I think, I respect Milton's perspective here, but the DoD, Congress, multiple administrations have disagreed with him. And I think that's the same on TikTok and the data security issue there. But there's also the issue of Huawei. Multiple administrations have come and said that there are vulnerabilities. We've looked at this. So in terms of, is $3 billion enough to get it out of our networks? I don't know. I would hope so, because we've already spent billions of dollars doing this. But I also think that it's easy to focus in on Huawei and ZTE. And it's easy to forget that there's a lot of other hardware manufacturers that we should also be looking at. I mean, TP-Link is one. The routers in our homes, the routers that several government agencies are actually using have been implicated. It was implicated in Salt Typhoon, was implicated in Vulcan Typhoon. I mean, they've been used, some of these routers have been used to hack the European Parliament and the European Union. And so while I think the Secure Equipment Act was a great starting place, and it set up a great mechanism for the FCC, the NTIA, and the Executive Office of the President to look at some of these things. I think we need to start looking at the tech stack holistically. Yeah, we should definitely get rid of Huawei and ZTE equipment in our networks. I think we should be working to get them out of networks internationally in the European Union and South America and Africa. But we also need to be thinking about the other parts of the tech stack and where some of those vulnerabilities are going to come from.
Milton?
Let me go, since then Milton can respond to the three of us, because I'm in agreement with these two. So, Huawei is an issue. I'd say both that what Jim was saying, that Huawei does work for works for the Chinese government, but also it's in the other direction as well. The Chinese government supports Huawei around the world and makes the cost of giving equipment to other countries at a big discount or free in a lot of cases happen and supports that work. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to have our allies aware of that as well. I think that it's, in fact, and I was feeling pretty good yesterday when I read that Secretary Rubio announced that they are releasing $25 million to Costa Rica, which is meant as a cybersecurity protection that comes out of the ransomware attack, but it also is a sign that we're willing to support them and to build their networks back up, and not have Huawei move in there. And I think that's you have to read that as part of the message from that release. And I think that it's a good sign that we're willing to fight internationally, to continue this fight internationally, even as there's been this pullback internationally, because it does directly affect U.S. networks to have international networks. So that's, I think, where I agree with what Jim was saying, that the international does affect us, our own networks inside the U.S., and we have to be aware of that.
Milton, any response?
Yeah, so we're wasting $3 billion for nothing. Nobody has attributed a single hack that has been attributed to the Chinese to the use of Chinese equipment, right? We actually broke in to Huawei's headquarters and spied on their communications for several years. And we didn't find any evidence of any specific attempt to use Huawei as an intelligence tool. This is not to say that it couldn't be used as such, of course, but that's exactly the point. It's sort of like the assumption here is that it's a risk and it's a danger because it's Chinese and for no other reason. And we're pretending like we cannot monitor traffic. We know so little about cybersecurity that we cannot see whether things have been compromised and whether data is being exfiltrated. I teach cybersecurity. I know about malware. I know about plants. And, it's not like you can't find that stuff out. And so if these rural telephone companies that we're going to waste $3 billion telling them to get stuff out, and we're going to deny them the benefits of competition and equipment, which is why the UK stuck with Huawei originally, why hasn't there been any compromise or major problem with these rural telecom networks? Where was the threat? Okay, so again, look at how this is impacting global trade in digital products. He's saying we need to go out and subsidize Costa Rica and God knows how many other countries to buy, American equipment? And they're going to, because they're subsidizing with loans Huawei equipment in the developing world, right? So where does this go? Where does this lead us?
Jim, you're making a face. Do you have any thoughts?
No, if you talk to the GCHQ, BND, the Japanese NPA, Australia, the ASD, there's a whole range of intelligence agencies that would tell you Huawei poses a threat. So
tells us what?
Huawei is a threat for signals collection. I had fun with Huawei. Huawei used to talk to me, and I kind of miss them. They were a lot of fun. But at one of the meetings, they said, well, why do you keep saying we're involved? Why do you keep saying we have connections to the intelligence community in China? And I said, well, look, your vice chair came out of MSS. It's on your website. And they said, oh, really? A week later, it was off their website. I don't know. Leap to your own conclusion.
So how many American executives of telecom and companies or AI companies have backgrounds in the Air Force or the military?
The Chinese do say that. They say, what are you complaining about? You do it too. It's a fair point. We don't do it.
It's sort of like saying the internet was funded by the Defense Department, right? It's what was it Putin said? It's a CIA project. Is that what you're saying about that?
Why don't we move to the next question?
I was going to watch this play out a little longer, but sticking with, thank you, Ari, for bringing up the news about Costa Rica and the funding, which, just a plug for Politico, my colleague got the scoop on yesterday. But I want to ask, after a couple weeks of a lot of debate over the pause in foreign aid by the U.S. that has included cyber tech support by the U.S. to countries like Costa Rica, Albania, others, as well as many different programs through USAID. So of course we have now the funds restarting to Costa Rica, but for everyone on the panel, what's the impact of this pause in foreign aid in terms of support to our allies and partners on tech, cyber operations, and how does this potentially open the door for China to, come back in and offer some of their support, some of their products in these nations with the U.S. at least temporarily stepping back for whoever wants to start on that question?
I'll be the provocative one. So I guess the provocative statement is I truly don't understand some of the pearl clutching about USAID and what's going on. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable for an administration to come in, and USAID has a long history of graft and waste, fraud, and abuse. This used to be a bipartisan issue, and now because President Trump is doing it, it's become a very political thing. I mean, essentially what they're doing is pausing aid so that they could figure out where this $40 billion is going. And we were already seeing a lot of this funding go, start to restart and go out the doors. I'm a very strong proponent of internet freedom programs. We've supported the Open Technology Fund and USAGM. I support a lot of the things that USAID does, but I think we do it as a service to do the pearl clutching and say, oh, this independent agency that doesn't really have very much oversight, that we don't really know what they're doing with all this funding, that this is such a huge problem. So I think the impact on actual, cybersecurity programs and things that we're doing internationally is very minimal because, I mean, it's been 3 weeks. Like, if your program in wherever can't operate for 3 weeks without U.S. money, then, I think that's a separate problem that we need to be considering.
Thoughts from any other panelists? Jim?
So in speaking to the previous senior officials in the previous administration with a national security or diplomatic portfolio, they agreed with the statement that foreign aid was a tool we used in the Cold War for political purposes. Cold War ended, and so it drifted more towards social objectives, right? Social policy, and that we needed to reorient foreign assistance to be a tool of foreign policy and security policy again. And so that's a process that's underway. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, that, when you find, there were a number of unusual things, I'm not sure I would characterize them as graft, but USAID funding Huawei, for example, probably a mistake, indirectly through the World Bank, but we have to restore the focus on national security. The way it was in it was created as a Cold War tool, and it's back, sorry, but that's what we're gonna need to do.
Well, as I said, I'm very glad that they've reopened the funding for the purposes, for cybersecurity purposes, and especially in the case with Costa Rica. I want to speak up that I'll just say, I worked with people from state and USAID that did funding, and I found all of them to be very committed to the mission and wanting to do the right thing, and not, I think that we're seeing them kind of tarred as being, lazy and looking out for graft. That's the furthest thing from the truth. They could have been doing other things. It's hard to get those jobs, right? These are people with high degrees. They could have been doing a lot of other things, and they went to the USAID because they wanted to help other people. So I think that's important to put in here as well.
And we probably ought to double down on Ari's point, is that these people were really concerned about what their mission was. We need to redefine the mission, but Ari's right.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I wasn't disparaging anybody that works at USAID. I think that they're all good people that are doing good work, but I think it's also, the question needs to be asked, what is the mission now? I think to Jim's point, this is a Cold War. What is the point of doing DEI programs in Sudan? I don't get it.
I agree with that. I don't think you need to fire everybody in the agency to get to that point, though. I think you can have them work with you to figure that out, especially because but from what I've seen, they're all committed to the mission. So why not have them open and help them redefine, the people that know, help you redefine the mission.
And just Milton, do you have any thoughts before I?
Just that if Trump, and again, I'm not endorsing or criticizing Trump's agenda here, I'm just saying if his agenda is to sort of be America first, pull back from the internationalism of the Biden, or not really the Biden administration, but previous, Democratic administrations. If that's his agenda, then the attack on AID makes sense in this, but it's so small a part of that Cold War agenda, or that carryover Cold War, that you might look at it as them picking on the most vulnerable target and seeing how far they can go. Because I can't think of any other way why Musk would run around saying that it's a criminal organization, right? This is just clearly an exaggeration, and they're picking out a lot of absurd things that are being funded and exaggerating it. So I would look at this as more as a signal of, where we might be going rather than as a thing in itself.
And it's been pointed out to me, at least in the space around technology, countering disinformation, that with the U.S. kind of temporarily stalling aid, or in some cases eliminating programs, we are opening the door to countries like China, Russia, to move into some of these nations. How, as part of the sort of reconsideration of U.S. foreign aid, can the U.S. ensure that we're not kind of leaving some of these positive relationships on the table for some of our adversaries to potentially take advantage of in the space of cyber tech disinformation? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I agree with what Jim was saying before about adding on to, it's got to be the focus. The first focus has to be national security, and trying to be the first focus of that is certainly okay with me. And looking at it from that angle of the threats there, especially what we've seen with Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and the efforts there. Like, we know that there's a direct threat to our critical infrastructure that comes from being tied into other nations as part of this, right? I mean, and other networks. So I think that's a good place to start the conversation.
Both the Russians and the Chinese do have programs and plans for doing the kinds of things that USAI to do. I don't know if you saw, there was a note yesterday, I forgot where it was, but the Russians are pretty unhappy that their plan isn't working. For some reason, people don't seem to desire to join a Russian-led coalition. Don't know why. But the Chinese are a little more effective. They have problems too. The government put satellite televisions in about 2,500 African villages, and that was great. And they offered educational programs, which is a plus. But they also offered entertainment. And apparently, that's where it failed. Is nobody wanted to watch Chinese television. So, but the fact that they haven't figured out how to do it doesn't mean we can take a breather and step on the sideline. We have to compete the way we used to compete, and that's where I think USAID is essential.
Yeah, I think 3 quick points on this. One, I think if we're talking about cybersecurity, we also need to focus on American cybersecurity, right? Like, this is money that's going to our allies, and that's very important, but we're also not spending enough domestically on securing our critical infrastructure and the like. If we're talking about the use of sharp power internationally, I think that the Chinese were very successful in leapfrogging legacy technology in the global south, right? Like, the fact that you can just build cell towers instead of having to build a whole telephone network is crazy. But the United States now has the advantage again with the changes and the advancements in fixed wireless technology and satellite technology, satellite internet. I would be leveraging the American competitiveness in those industries, if we're talking about kind of infrastructure and sharp power. But finally, supporting the work that we're doing in software. We've been a long time supporters of the Open Technology Fund, USAGM. All these programs go back to the Cold War, and I think that they were far more effective. I mean, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, I would argue, were far more effective than direct foreign investment in infrastructure in countries. And I don't know if y'all would agree with that, but there's a lot of things that we can do that don't necessarily involve USAID as an entity.
Look, if you're talking about influence operations, that is to say, sort of global competition in the realm of soft power and ideas, then the most important thing the U.S. has to do is actually stand for the right values, right? If we are actually free and prosperous, people will like that and they will get the message. If we are saying we stand for freedom and we're against authoritarianism, and then we start banning apps and restricting trade, we're undercutting our message, and people know this. I mean, I have African students in my class, and we had the TikTok debate, and they were like, this isn't America. Why are you doing this, right? That is completely clashing with their image. So quite apart from USAID, we have to stand for something consistent that is different from the Chinese Communist Party. We have to stop imitating their policies and their tactics.
So I can't let the panel go by as a cyber reporter without asking at least one cyber question. Ari, you mentioned Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon. For those who aren't familiar, some major Chinese cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure in the past few years. In the case of Salt Typhoon, the infiltration of wide swaths of U.S. telecommunication networks and targeting government officials, including the compromise of President Trump's phone. Now that this has been happening the last few months, the Trump administration is in power now. I mean, it was a pretty personal attack linked to China against the Trump administration officials in power. How do you think the Trump administration may be looking at responding to this? I know we're still in early days, officials still aren't in place, but it is still potentially a very active hack going on and a pretty brazen one in terms of targeting Trump himself pretty personally. So I don't know, Jim, Ari, as sort of more cyber experts on the panel, if you had thoughts on next steps.
Well, I mean, at the end of the Biden administration, they put together this executive order, which was probably the most detailed executive order I've ever seen, that went into addressing both sets of attacks as part of what they were doing. And the Trump administration so far has kept that. I think they probably will rewrite it a bit, but I think parts of it will stay, and they'll probably add their own pieces to it as well. So I think that it's something that is being reviewed right now. There is a kind of a framework out there. This has been like a bipartisan issue to ensure that we continue to protect our critical infrastructure. I think it will continue to be that way, and that's a good signal if we're taking pieces of this executive order and making it Trump's own executive order, but really moving forward some of the ideas and then coming up with new ones on top of it.
So there's a domestic aspect to cybersecurity, and the executive order laid out it was detailed because it was a sort of follow-on to the first executive order, and hopefully parts of it will stick. That was the theory. Why are you putting out an executive order so late? Because it's just things that anyone would do, no matter what party they're from. The other side of cybersecurity is the international side, and on that one, our last serious talks with the Chinese on cybersecurity were in 2015. And so the Chinese are not interested in renewing discussion with us on this, and they've pretty much said that. It's interesting, thanks, we'll get back to you. As long as China is unwilling to make concessions on reducing their level of very aggressive espionage, you're going to continue to have cybersecurity problems. You can't have a giant country do that. Now, to be fair, the Chinese say, well, what are you blaming us for? You do that too. To me, as an ex-negotiator, that sounds like a space for a deal. You think we're doing it, we know you're doing it. Is there some middle ground? But right now, they're not willing to talk. And that will be one of the challenges for the Trump administration, is getting the Chinese. Behind all this, what are the Chinese actually looking at? They're looking at what they assume is their eventual coronation as the leading nation of the world. They think they're on track to do that. they're also looking near term at the effect on trade. And so there is possibly with TikTok or with cybersecurity, some trade deal that could include aspects of that. But right now, we're not talking things are bad. It's not going to get better.
Before I move on, did you, either of you have any?
Yeah, I think the good thing about the Salt Typhoon incident is that clearly it was a cybersecurity vulnerability that had very little to do with the nationality of the equipment providers. They exploited American providers, they exploited for various kinds of equipment, and they exploited our own built-in vulnerability through CALIA, right? Which is something we should be emphasizing here. So cybersecurity is what it's about. It's not as much about geopolitical competition as you might think. It's like states are going to do intelligence. We are doing it to them, they're doing it to us. It's never going to stop. The question is, can we protect our infrastructure by adopting sound cybersecurity practices and implementing them and catching and detecting the intruders? That's what it's going to be all about.
And that leads to the dread R word, which is you have to regulate. One of the companies that was a victim in Salt Typhoon used as a default password 1111. Damn, that fooled them, our Chinese. No, of course it didn't. So how do you, it will be a challenge, it was a challenge for every administration since the internet has been done, but how do you regulate cybersecurity to require companies to pay? Ari, I don't know if you have you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back, like we had Black Energy 12 years ago, right? It's a constant effort here where we know that our adversaries are seeding the battlefield and putting malware into our critical infrastructure, and we're constantly trying to pull it out and make sure that we're being protected. I think we have raised over the years, I mean, through the efforts that we have raised the protections on a wide range of critical infrastructure. I mean, a few years ago, healthcare was really not protected at all. It's gotten much better than it was. Still has a long way to go. The energy sector, when Black Energy happened, had very few protections. Now pretty well protected. Has raised its game. Still has a ways to go. So we continue to get better and better. The adversaries only have to be right once, right, to get in. So and they get better too. So this is not like most other threats to critical infrastructure where you can solve it and then the problem goes away. It's going to be going on, as Milton was saying, going to be going on forever in terms of getting better and better, and the protections have to continue to get better as well. So we're going to have to keep investing in it. And I think it is an area where we have to work together to make that happen. And to date, that's happened. I feel confident that the people that I'm hearing are going into the Trump administration to do this are good people that have experience in this space and would be ready for it, to work with them. So, yeah.
Well, I think I might be cursed by some sort of tech conference issue if I don't bring up artificial intelligence at some point. As we speak, well, they're probably asleep by now, but at least earlier today, the AI Action Summit was taking place in France. And last week, the Trump administration asked for comment on creating an AI action plan as part of, setting out the administration's agenda on putting, safeguards around the use of AI. So where do you think the Trump administration is going on this, and how is it likely to butt heads with the approach being looked at over in Brussels and other EU capitals?
Well, I think the first place is that we should look is Vice President Vance gave a speech in Paris today at the AI summit. If you haven't watched it, if you want to know what the Trump administration is going to do on AI, just don't take it from me. Just go watch that speech. He lays out a pretty strong case for American competitiveness and geopolitical in the midst of geopolitical competition on this. And so I think the AI EOs have already been repealed. They're working on it. I think this is one of the, it's really important that we get the right people in place quickly. This is an important issue, and we can't afford to wait a long time in order to get the people in the White House to start working on some of this. I think in terms of concrete changes, right, there's going to be a lot less focus on security. There's going to be a lot less focus on bias in the kind of in the broad sense of those terms. Obviously, in red states across the country, we're looking at legislation that is focused on civil rights violations. So I think that'll be a part of it, but it'll be narrowly tailored. And then finally, I have to give a shameless plug because our team just put out a paper on the issues of intellectual property and copyright and the importance of maintaining access to data, maintaining access to the open web for people building AI systems in terms of international competitiveness. And so that's, I mean, in terms of what Trump's going to do, just go watch the speech. Like, don't listen to me.
I'd like to say that to frame AI as a geopolitical issue, I'm going to talk more about, again, international trade in AI capabilities. So we should not do anything like this Josh Hawley bill that's come up. It's sort of the Decoupling America from Chinese AI Act, in which he's trying to regulate all forms of knowledge and production in order to somehow magically segregate the United States from China. It's, again, just going to be a replay of the TikTok issue in a certain sense. But I think there's something fundamentally misguided about the way we're talking about AI governance, and that is we're talking about regulating the technology. So I heard somebody say, I think it was Marsha Blackburn, is like, oh, I don't want somebody using AI to do cybersecurity problems, right? And it's like, I'm sorry, everybody who can sit down at a computer and program it is going to come up with cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploit them if they can get away with it, right? So it's nothing to do with, you cannot somehow magically regulate the technology so that no one can ever use it to do something bad. That just isn't how it works. If you're worried about discriminatory applications, then we have laws against discrimination. So it doesn't matter if you're discriminating in your hiring, whether it's an AI application or whether it's some racist dude sitting at a table, it's illegal, right? And the same with the cybersecurity implications of AI. It's like you have to look at what a specific application does and then decide whether it is against the law or there should be a law that makes it illegal. So the problem with the European approach, which is going to be very costly to them, is that they are trying to regulate in advance. They're trying to license, in effect, AI according to risk determinations, which are unknown. We do not know, we do not have actuarial data about the risks. There are thousands of machine learning applications that are out there or are going to be out there. We have no idea how risky they are until they're used. So I think we have to promote American leadership in this by having a kind of very free and open trade in computing, which is what it is. It's not AI, it's computing or distributed computing. And that will be something where competition will benefit everybody.
This is a red letter moment because Milton and I actually agree on something.
I'll say that, I think that in this kind of security versus AI discussion, sometimes we miss the point that security companies have been using AI forever, right? So since the beginning of security companies, right, they've been using in order to try and figure out the next threats, et cetera. So I think that security companies, AI getting better is good for security. And I want to state that plainly before I say the other piece of it, which kind of aligns with some of the things Bill was saying, is that we will regret the day where we said security wasn't important for how AI will function going forward very quickly. So I think that we have to keep vigilant on the side of looking at security flaws in AI code and in AI products, et cetera. But on the other side, as I was saying, I think we don't want to slow down innovation because it helps us with security as much as it's going to hurt us.
So this is a geopolitics session, and one way to think about it is there's three power centers. There's the US, there's China, and the European Union. And the actions of these three will shape the internet moving forward. We've sort of touched on some of them, but For the European Union, the thing that concerns me is there's really good data that their regulatory approach has stifled innovation. And when I started working with Europeans in the 1990s, they had tech companies that were equivalent to American tech companies, and their regulations killed them. They complain they don't have any tech giants. That's because they killed them, right? And so for us, the US, a strategic problem is how do we help the Europeans revive their economy that has to be digital, right? They're starting to get it. And so I keep referring to the Draghi report, and that's a good test. If you meet a person from Brussels, ask them, have you read the Draghi report? And the answer is too often no. So the issue for us is not regulate or not regulate AI. It's how do we use it in a way that increases security and wealth. And I think that the regulatory approach taken in many places, and that was the earlier panel, doesn't contribute to those goals.
Well, since the previous panel went over a little bit of time, this one is going to go about 10 minutes longer. And we have a couple minutes left before I'll release you all to lunch. Does anyone have any questions for the panelists on any topics we've discussed? Or, yes, I think we have a microphone coming.
Hello, my name is Tom Bowman, and I'm from the Center for Democracy and Technology. One recent event that I've been following very closely and concerned about is the Washington Post publication of the UK issuing the technical capability notice against Apple, which effectively would require Apple to maintain backdoor access for encrypted data. And in particular, the way that Americans' data might be caught up in that if Apple is actively required to enable backdoor access. This is an area where I think the US should affirmatively take a stance and set a norm that says that we are going to promote security by promoting encrypted services. I'm curious to hear whether the panelists agree with that and whether there are other discrete policy areas where the Trump administration should take affirmative actions to start setting further norms in the geopolitical arena.
Affirmative action, that sounds kind of DEI. I don't know about the Trump administration, but no, totally with you on that. We should totally put our foot down to the British and say that's not happening, because it is an American company. And this is one of the dilemmas of internet governance, is that the globalization created by the internet means that, as we learned with GDPR, if you can force everybody to conform to your rules, then it has global effect. And we cannot have that. You know, Apple is global in scope, and if they build a back door, it's going to affect all of us.
Yes, I totally agree. If they build a back door for the UK, then they can build a back door for China, right? And that gets to a lot of the things we've been talking about earlier in this panel. So,
assuming they already haven't. And so there's not a black or white answer here, right? And security agencies hate end-to-end encryption. I get it. On the other hand, it's been downloaded billions of times, too late. So my advice is think of ways, there are technical means to circumvent this without having to get the company to cooperate. And that's probably what you're going to have to resort to.
I'm just going to push back a little bit and say that I think it's moving a little bit so that it's not so much security companies, it's only law enforcement at this point that hates it. I feel like security agencies generally, if you look at the advice from security agencies at this point, it promotes end-to-end encryption.
No, I don't think of security companies as
security agencies, I'm saying.
Security agencies.
Even the NSA, if you look at some of the things the NSA has said recently, if you look at what CISA has said, they support end-to-end encryption.
You need a technical solution that will give you access to information in a crisis, and people who found it might be less comfortable with what the UK is doing with Apple.
Yeah, and I'll be real quick that, I mean, I obviously support end-to-end encryption. I'm not familiar with this specific act, so I can't speak to that specifically. But I also think that we need to be careful about where we're getting our information. Apple regularly makes statements about security and privacy that are proven not true when we're talking about the DMA and the DSA. When Apple says that it's impossible to do something or it's going to prove something, I mean, just check who's actually saying that. And again, I don't know about the specific geopolitics about this particular thing, I totally believe you. But when specific companies are making claims and maliciously complying with regulations in Europe, like, I don't know, I just call BS sometimes.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, right here.
Yeah, the title of the panel was geopolitics. So let me ask whether the United Nations and the ITU, are they actually a threat for government control, especially when they meet later this year, or are they just a paper tiger?
Paper tiger. You probably know my answer to that. I think the ITU is a multilateral treaty organization. It has no real points of leverage over the internet governance infrastructure, such as the address registries, the DNS route, or the standards making process, unless we give it to them. And we're not going to, the United States is not going to give it to them. That's actually a wonderful point of bipartisan consensus. That Right.
Well, think of it as the ITU is sort of a standard setting body, and so their role in security is limited. The UN has both a standard setting role or a norm setting role, and also some larger political role. And I was surprised that we got through the panel without saying the words cybercrime convention. And we don't have to talk about it, I'm sure everyone's divided, but the rest of the world has moved in a certain direction. How useful it is to have the UN. I used to work there. It's got limited utility, but it's a tool that we could use to help move things in our direction. And if we don't, the other guys will.
I would just say, I think we're minimizing the impact of the ITU. Spectrum is a really big issue, and spectrum harmonization is really important if we're talking about geopolitics, whether that's for the DoD or for private use. I think the UN is totally a paper tiger. I mean, this is why the UN ambassador is always like a laurel that's given to some big political donor. Like, I just don't care what happens in New York.
The problem is that's true in the short term. It's not true in the long term. And so we've made this mistake before. We're not going to vote for the law of the sea, right? And that will teach them. And eventually the rest of the world wires around the United States. But yeah, short term, paper tiger, long term, political effect.
And I had hoped to ask about the cybercrime convention, but we ran out of time.
Just as well.
So thank you for that. Well, I think that we're at about time. I want to thank the panelists for being here today, and enjoy your lunch. Thanks.
You never know.
Yes.
All right. We'll go ahead and get started. So I know some folks will be filtering in. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this discussion on AI at work. My name is Stephen Overley. I host Politico's Daily Tech Podcast. And I'll kick us off by saying that AI is already in the workplace. I think if we were having this conversation last year or the year before, there would be a big what if component. But we now know that this technology is being used. We have better understanding of its benefits and its limitations, and we're starting to see its impact on the workforce. So I think that all really sets the stage for a pretty dynamic conversation today. And so to tackle some of the big questions about AI at work, I've got a great lineup here. We have Amber Ezel, Policy Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum, Dr. Athena Kanyora, the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer at PepsiCo, and then finally Ellen Satterwhite, Principal at Invariant. Welcome. So I want to kick us off with a little bit of news from this morning at another tech policy summit in the far less glamorous city of Paris. Vice President J.D. Vance spoke about the administration's AI priorities, and he said the following. He said, "This administration wants to be clear about one last point. We will always center American workers in our AI policy. We refuse to view AI as purely a disruptive technology that will inevitably automate away our labor force."
I'd be interested to hear from each of you kind of your reaction to that quote and that sort of statement of the administration's priorities.
I'll start since I'm at this end. Hi, I'm Ellen Satterwhite. I'm not Brent, playing the role of Brent today. So I represent and work with early stage companies all across technology, but particularly hard tech companies. So some of these companies are trying to bring jobs to the US that have not been done here for years, or to reinvent an entire industry. So for example, our entire defense industrial base is based on a network of machine shops, thousands and thousands of tiny machine shops. The average age of the owner is 63. These are very, very small shops. People are not buying these shops, and they are, when the owners decide to retire, the shops no longer exist. So I have a few clients in this space who agree wholeheartedly with what the Vice President, I think, laid out very well, which is AI and automation can help us create entirely new categories of work for people. Good, high-paying, high-wage, really status jobs for folks. And so when we think about how this administration is thinking about those policies and kind of thinking about what that means for the American worker, I think the idea that AI can actually supercharge people and supercharge entire industries is really an interesting one.
Maybe I'll take it from there. So Athena Kanyura, I'm the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer of PepsiCo. And obviously, I echo your comments, Ellen, because it's in reality, he just voiced over what every government official believes, that AI is here to augment humans, is here to enable humans to do their job better rather than replace those jobs. Let's not forget when automation hit the manufacturing sector, that was a much bigger disruptive factor for the industry. Comparing to what AI's promise is now, we see it as PepsiCo. We have been rolling out AI, including Gen AI, for the past, I would say, 5 years with traditional AI, the past 18 months aggressively with Gen AI. We have added people in our workforce. Jobs have become better, jobs have become more efficient, less manually intensive in some cases if you were to create this combo between industrial automation and AI and digital twins, especially for the manufacturing and warehousing. So we wholeheartedly believe that both the US administration and every other government out there who is investing in AI are thinking the right way of amplification of the human experience.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amber Ezel, AI Policy Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum based in DC. I would definitely agree with what my co-panelists have said right now so far with regard to just the importance of keeping humans at the center. We recently put out some HR and AI best practices that really talks about the importance of human engagement, especially as AI is integrated into work jobs and work processes that normally would have been done by a human. And so definitely agree with not leaving humans out of the picture. And then also, I think one of the things that was captured in the quote that Stephen, that you provided, is just the importance of making sure that nobody is left behind. I think we're at a point in time where a lot of people feel threatened by AI, but I think that there's a lot of potential for AI to really not replace people, but really enhance what people have already been doing for a really long time. So I think we're at an exciting moment when it comes to AI and innovation.
When I heard the comments as a journalist, kind of my instinctive reaction is, that sounds nice, but how are you going to do it, right? How do you actually put this into action? And one of the things the Vice President also said was talking about the need to train workers, the need to educate students about how to use AI. And he went on to say that government and industry have an obligation to kind of prepare the workforce for AI. And so, Ellen, I'll come to you first with this. As someone who's worked in government and worked inside companies, what do you see as sort of the biggest challenge to achieving that, especially kind of getting those two to coordinate and work together?
I think right now, the challenge is how quickly everything is moving. So just as a small example, I last night kind of taught myself how to use ChatGPT to create a media report for something, and the prompt engineering that I used to do that is totally different than it would have been even a couple months ago, right? We just know so much more now. The models are operating at a quicker and quicker scale, or faster scale. So I think one is pace of change. Two is when government and industry work well together, there is a high degree of trust. And I think right now we're at the beginning of a new administration and it's just time to reestablish trust. So that's always something that will slow you down a little bit. And then finally, I think the hallmarks of what make these things work well, there are plenty of analogs in our past because all of our incentives are aligned, right? Industry, government, all of us as citizens, our incentives are aligned for this to work well because none of us want to live in a society where it goes wrong. So I don't know, I think I'm probably a little techno-optimistic for others, but hopefully that gives you an idea.
Athena, Pepsi is an example of a company going through this transition. I mean, you are reskilling workers, you're retraining workers whose jobs are being transformed by AI. Can you give us some insight into what that actually looks like on the ground? I mean, how much are you investing in this? Are you letting workers go? Are you keeping everyone on? What does that actually look like in practice?
Sure. So just to give you the facts, we have 325,000 employees globally. 60% of those sit in the States. 85% of those employees are frontline workers, which means people in the factories, in the warehouses, logistics, our truck drivers, our salespeople. So people who make, move, and sell our products. And not necessarily all of them have a college degree, which is quite important, right? I mean, they might have come from community colleges, some of them from high school, some of them are technicians. So we have the full spectrum of what you will find in the society. So we are representative of what sits in the society. So when we started with our big digital transformation program, AI being part of that digital transformation program, we've made an informed decision that we need in parallel to upskill and reskill all the workers across every spectrum of function, business, geography, to make sure that all of them have an opportunity to still be part of PepsiCo after the transformation, right? That is an extensive program of everything on, when we say cloud transformation, what do we mean? When we say data transformation and data foundation, what do we mean? How does it relate to you? Insight-driven decisions. Then we went to digital solutions. And last, we went to AI applications. So you gave everyone across the spectrum of capabilities to experience AI in different ways. For our people in the factory, predominantly it was around health and safety. Predictive asset maintenance. How do you make sure you use the equipment in the most effective way for you to drive better performance for the facilities that you are running, but you also do it in a very safe way so you can have zero accidents at the plant. For the people in the warehouse, making sure that you know where your inventory is and you manage the logistics in your facility in such an effective way so you don't move stuff around unnecessarily and you have waste in the system. For our truck drivers, it is about less miles to reach your destination, but you do it in a way that maximizes your performance. In this case, performance is safety, right? So some examples that shows that when you give people the opportunity through extensive training, we have a digital academy, we have trained everyone in all those principles, people in the majority of the cases tend to be very positive about it. Now, not everyone, though, will be up for the challenge, right? Our responsibility as corporation, as a NGO, as a government, is to give people the platform, the opportunity to upskill, reskill themselves so they can be ready for the next domain, the next generation, the next transformation. But they were the ones that have chosen to still continue running the business or doing their tasks in the analog way. For those ones, we have given them opportunities to, through our association, we are part of the American Manufacturing Association, to also find jobs in the broader ecosystem and continue doing their activities the way they were used to. So, in this journey, we have to be cognizant that not everyone will want to embark in this transformation, but we do have a responsibility, as I said, to give everyone a chance to embark on the journey. What we see is that the generations to come are all 100% trained, right? You had a small gap in a certain cohorts of the population. We saw that in certain cohorts of our population. The last 10, 15 years of the generation that is coming in the workforce, they expect that you have this technology embedded. And then if you don't have it, they actually leave the companies. So you see very different type of challenges depending on the cohorts that you have currently employed in your workforce.
Just a quick follow-up for you. You know, there is an expectation, I think, among company executives, but especially their shareholders, that AI will save time and money. Is that true in your experience so far?
It's true. It's true. We see it already. For the companies that they use AI, again, at scale, I'm not talking about pilots, you see a positive impact in bottom line, both in operating margins and broader profitability and saving times and productivity. It's just on the company to see how you want to use these additional funds. I mean, you can either give that money back to the shareholders or you can reinvest back to the people and the business. In our case, we have decided to do the latter. So a lot of those funds were chosen to develop programs for our farmers because we are, at the heart, we are an agro business, right? So we gave back funds for our agro community, our farmers, especially in the US where it's our biggest farming community, to be able to upskill them, regenerative agriculture practices, precision agriculture, pesticide prevention, everything that we wanted to make sure that we take them to the next generation of farming practices. So that was one. The second is to the communities. We discussed a bit about the DNA of the employee of PepsiCo. I mean, they don't come, 25% of them, this is the first time they have had a college degree. Their previous generations didn't even have a college degree. So, and they are part of communities that for them working for PepsiCo is considered to be a privilege. So helping the communities is something that we also used some of these additional funds to give back. So as long as you use the productivity that you yield to drive better engagement, better community engagement, better employee engagement, fund other activities to drive better performance of the business, it's well needed for the business to perform. What is not good at, if we're going to use all those funds just to improve your bottom line.
Amber, I'm curious from your perspective, part of your work at the Future of Privacy Forum, you put together a policy checklist essentially, right, for employers who use generative AI. I'm curious, how did that tackle these questions of the responsibilities employers have to their employees, whether those are legal or ethical, however you want to look at it?
Yeah. So this is a really good question. So the checklist came about at a time where ChatGPT first came into the market, and employees were really curious about what exactly the potential for this tool would be. And it was around the time when AI started becoming like a household term. Obviously, artificial intelligence is not anything that's new, but the fact that it's giving
everyday people access to a technology that allows them to do the work that they are already doing even better. And so this generative AI checklist, it came about when employers were like, how do we make sure that we're still protecting privacy, data protection, trade secrets. And as employees are using these tools, how can we ensure that they're doing it in a responsible way? And so the best practices really help employers take their existing IT policies and really integrate into the mix, how they can preserve their company information, their customer data, employee data in a way that preserves privacy, but also gives, as Athena said, gives employees that platform to also innovate and make their jobs even easier and faster and better, and really spur that innovation and creativity as well.
Got it. Last year, I was really interested in whether anyone in Washington was working on a safety net for AI, kind of like a social safety net. And I really wanted to do a podcast episode about this, and I could not find anyone to talk to because it did not seem to be something anyone was working on. So if anyone's aware of that, let me know. But Ellen, I'm curious if that is a question that Washington should be grappling with. Will everyone find a new job in kind of the AI-powered workforce, or is there need to be some sort of safety net for displaced workers who don't quite land in the new economy?
I'm seeing the headline now of the, suggests entirely new entitlement at State of the Net. Stephen, I do think it's an interesting question, but I guess I think of it more like, so in a past life, I worked at the Federal Communications Commission. The Obama administration, Biden administration, Trump administration, former one, thought a lot about, we have this amazing technology, right? We have this general purpose technology, broadband, great, let's get those networks everywhere. But then what do people do with it? How do they make the best use of those platforms to do, to use this administration's terminology, to advance human flourishing? So I think more of it like training. What can we do to train? What can we do to ensure, to educate, right? We have these programs in place and that were in place at a different time. With rural electrification, we went out and showed people how to use a refrigerator, and we showed people how to use the technology that was then going to become a part of their daily lives. And that is where my mind goes more than creating sort of a fund to support people, in part because in this environment, it's not truly sustainable, but also that's how you actually advance these public purposes of, how do we diffuse this technology to its greatest impact for the most number of people throughout society?
Got it.
But I'll be on your podcast and I'll help you find people.
I'm telling you, it would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of fascinating conversations, I know when you and I have spoken in the past, one thing PepsiCo has done is created its own internal policies for AI and kind of its own AI governance framework. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the role workers played, if any, in setting those guidelines. And then also, is this an area, and I have to ask this delicately because we're in Washington, is this an area where government involvement would be helpful, or an area where you think, leave us alone, we've got this?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the former first, and then I'll get to the latter. When we started, I think it was like 3.5 years ago, 4 years, we started with a responsible AI framework first, which was about, what should be the governing body that we set up in the organization? How do we ensure data transparency, ethical AI, bias mitigation, algorithmic bias, all embedded into the whole cycle of how we design, develop, industrialize, roll out capabilities, AI models across the company. And so that was the beginning. And that framework was governed through 3 entities in the organization. It was my organization, S&T, which was chairing that, but also it was the legal department, Under me, I have also IT, so it implied that IT was co-governing that, and the finance community. Last year, we decided this framework will become a policy, which is a big difference, right? Because that means now it's institutionalized in the policies of the company that is reported externally. So if someone wants to see how we trace back models, how we use the models, for what type of activities, who is using it, now we have the obligation to report it. And that was intentional, because we said we want to be the first from all the industries to be able to make that framework a policy, so we can show both to our internal and external stakeholders that we know that AI can be used in an amplified way to be able to drive, as I said, better performance for the company, but also the employees. On top of that, we review with our board twice AI and the use of AI across the organization. So it has become also of the board reviews. Initially, it was 1 year. Last year, it became twice a year. That is to say that AI, if you want, it can become part of the core policies that you have in the company, the same way you have compliance, the same way you have ethics, the same way you do GDPR, you can also do responsible AI. So that's what we've done. Now, back to your question about the government. When the previous administration, as part of the RFP that NIST had put out on ethical AI and mitigation bias, we were the only one from the industry that submitted comments for the RFP. And all the others were the tech companies. So we absolutely need and we want the participation of the government in helping us and setting with us frameworks, policies, orders, maybe in the future laws in this space. Otherwise, every company will tend to do what every company needs to know best, but without a cohesive and consistent strategy across the full spectrum of everything that we need as big corporations. We don't see that happening. Probably it's going to be less of that in the future, not more of that. But what is at least promising, even with this administration, right? What the previous administration did was building on top of what Trump's administration had already prepared. So I'm hoping that this administration will also amplify what the two previous administrations had done rather than discard everything. Because a lot of the same committees, same members are still being considered for the same positions. So this is a hopeful message. We believe that we have both a role to play in setting up, as I said, rules, engagements, frameworks, eventually policies. We have a role to play, but we believe the government has a role to play.
Sorry, I think that cannot be underscored more, that if more industries should be most people in government would say, we want to hear from all parts of the economy before anything happens, before we do something that could have unintended consequences. And so to be a responsible business and step up and participate in the conversation, it is good for shareholder value, I think, at that point.
You know, it's interesting to me because when you look at surveys that have been done on the use of AI in the workplace, there's sort of two trends that stand out to me. One is that more workers are using AI in the workplace, including younger workers. But also when you ask people about their anxieties around AI, replacement of their job ranks high on the list. And I've often been told that, you know, when people use AI more, they'll realize it's, you know, here to help them, not here to replace them. And yet that anxiety is still persistent. And so, Amber, I'll kind of come to you first. I mean, is it a matter of convincing people that AI is like friend, not foe? And how do you do that in a way that doesn't feel disingenuous, frankly?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I know for me, I was very skeptical at first. I was like, what is this AI thing? And, you know, how is it going to enhance my everyday life? So I do think it's a matter of convincing people first and foremost to just use it, right? To just try it out and take away that uncertainty. I think about, you know, like my mom, for example. She's very like traditional, has, had, type of jobs where she's been doing very like administrative type work. And I remember when I first told her about ChatGPT, she was very confused and she was like, I don't get it. And so I think, first there's that education piece, making sure that people understand first and foremost, what is artificial intelligence? Like what is, generative AI in that particular case, and what can it do and what it can't do. I think a lot of times, people, when they are skeptical of certain things, one, it's because they haven't necessarily tried it. And then two, I think that it comes from just a misunderstanding of what the intention and purpose is behind it. I think when we think about how AI can be integrated into people's jobs, I think that that's where employee like training comes into place and why it's so important for employers to have policies set in place because employees are going to use it, right? They're going to explore it, even if they don't necessarily know what it is. If they see their colleague able to do a task in a matter of minutes that it may have taken that particular employee hours, then they're probably going to be a little bit curious because they're going to be like, well, I don't want to be replaced. And so I think as it's being integrated into the workforce more, that's why it's so important to be a little bit proactive in making sure that employees have that level of comfort to feel like they can use it as opposed to being skeptical or having that fear associated with it. And I think that is just going to come with time. I think when, like the internet first came into existence, a lot of people were like, what exactly is this? And I was even thinking about the other day, even Amazon, when Amazon first came into play and became more commonly used, I was like, well, why would I order things online when I can just go to the store to pick it up? And it took a while for me to wrap my mind around it. But then as I started using it more, now it's hard to imagine, not going and ordering something online or going, ordering something from grocery pickup instead of going inside the store. So I think it's something that is going to take a little bit of time. But I do think that because of the capabilities that we've seen just in a short period of time, especially with generative AI, how fast it's developing and how capable it is. I think as people see that transformation, that they'll want to use it. And so I think it is just a matter of time and just making people feel comfortable and at ease at actually using the technology.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, just because I know you've done a lot of work around worker privacy and worker surveillance, which is another big issue or concern when it comes to AI. I mean, how integral is that to worker trust in this technology?
Oh, it's imperative. Like it's critical. I think the trust piece is a lot of why people tend to be skeptical when it comes to using new technologies. If people feel like they don't know exactly where their data is going or how it's being used, then they might not want to actually use the technology. So I think one of the things that we in our HR and AI best practices talk about is the importance of transparency, not just from developers of AI tools, but also deployers as well. If employees understand, where exactly is my data going? How is it being used? And if there are safeguards in place, even at the company level, if employees are putting, company information or proprietary information into an AI tool, then that's going to lose employer trust as well. So I think it's a two-way street, making sure that employees are trained and have an understanding of where exactly the data is going, but also that employers can understand, how they can protect employee information as well. Because, for example, like in an HR context, if let's say an HR manager is inputting
employer customer data into a system, and they weren't necessarily trained in, where that data is going, and if they used, maybe like a public tool, for example, because they didn't know any better, then that's going to obviously like lead to a loss of trust for customers, for employees, and even employers as well. And so making sure that there's trust as employees are using these tools, but then also making sure that as employers are using employee information, like for hiring, for example, that's a big use that we're seeing is with employment. If people don't know exactly how their data is being used, and making sure that employers are collecting the least amount of data as possible on employees, then I think, there's a lot of opportunity for things to go awry. So.
Great. I've got a few more questions and then I'll come to the audience. So if you have questions, please have those ready. There are a few kind of nascent policy ideas for grappling with any fallout from AI on the workforce, and some of them maybe feel very far out, but I'm curious to throw them out there and see if it's something that you all have even thought about in your line of work. The first one, which I think is talked about probably most, is universal basic income, right? This idea, Sam Altman from OpenAI and others have talked about whether there's a need for some sort of salary benefit assurance for workers as we move toward this AI economy, however fast that happens. Is that something that you all in your work nowadays are thinking at all about?
I'll jump on this one. I work with startups, early stage companies. I work with people with huge brains and expansive minds, and this absolutely comes up in conversation. UBI, but then also portable benefits, and the idea that your sort of floor of kind of basic survival is not necessarily tied to your job. That helps you be more secure and learn more. I think we're probably a little far off from the political reality, from UBI or something becoming a political reality, but it's certainly something people talk about. And more than they did, I think, more than they did even 2-3 years ago.
Not in the industry. Yeah, it doesn't come up because obviously people want to be paid per their contribution. Whether we like it or not, we don't live in a communist system society, right? So it's what we have a responsibility as a multinational company who operates in every country, depending on the laws of each country about how kind of people should be compensated. There is minimum wage, there is wage on top, base wage that we provide. So I'm diverting, obviously, from UBI. But UBI is a very utopistic approach. Let's see if it's a feasible approach on how you can compensate for lack of skills or actually proliferation of skills in some of the cases. I do believe, though, there will not be a need. AI is catching up so quickly. To your point about your mom, we see everyone, every consumer is using it in their personal application, personal life. Why wouldn't you use it for work? You have to ask yourself, why you use it to be doing your tasks, your chores, your grocery, and you don't want to use it at work, right? It's not because you cannot do, it's because you choose not to, right? So what can you do to give you the security, the safe space to use it proactively rather than go to the extreme? So let me apply a UBI. It sounds very, as I said, very backward-looking comparing to forward-looking. And that's a European talking, by the way, right? So it means something.
Are there any audience questions at the moment? One back here. I think there's a microphone.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Pesner. My question comes down to a practical use of AI that I've been personally trying to figure out right now. So, for example, people ask me, do you use AI to write cover letters when you're applying for jobs or to write drafts of articles? And I say no, because most of the time the AI isn't versed well enough in the particulars of the situation in order to be able to do that. Now, I know over time there may be ways to train it, but then there's the question of whether that's actually worth the effort. So I'm curious, in a real rubber meets the road perspective, what are the uses of AI in the context of particular workplaces where it feels like it's kind of a plug and play solution and not dependent on a lot of particular factors of the situation?
Maybe I'll start with a couple of examples to your point. The obvious one is everything in the customer service space. So if you were to think, and we have taken it to a bit of an extreme level right now. So every company has call centers. As part of the call centers, what do you want to do? To have a superior customer service for consumers, customers, employees, no matter what, right? So currently, we are using Gen AI, not just to be able to interact with the customer, but now we are trying AI agents. So, because what we have seen is humans tend to want to speak first to the tech rather than the person. And then if they don't resolve things with the tech, they would like to go to the person. On that, you don't need this level of personalization, further customization, because the majority of the issues that you encounter when you do call a call center fall into three major categories. Either it's an inquiry, it's a complaint, or it's a specific ticketing you have on technology, right? So in these type of cases, Gen AI is super effective. You get resolution 75–80% of the cases. In the cases where you applied more, you need more creative thinking. You need to be able to have much more history, personal history of the individual, try to understand the specific circumstances of the individual. To write a CV and a cover letter assumes that you know enough of that person's practical experience, both academic and personal, to be able to customize them the content. Then you need your personal LLM. It's not about the company LLM, right? And we need to acknowledge that there will be enterprise LLMs that are very important for generic enterprise-wide use cases, like the one I gave. And more you will see functional or personal LLMs that employees will create for themselves. So we have cohorts of employees, as an example, our design team, that has personal LLMs to create new designs and products for our cans. So when we had our new Pepsi brand logo, to give you an example, they experimented a lot on the brand logo by using LLMs to see, okay, what would fit better the consumer's expectation. So it's both, but we are still a long way to go before we go to personal LLMs because they are extremely expensive to be able to industrialize.
Any other questions from the audience before I can ask another one? I've got a long list. Oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. My name is Maxwell. I am a Google Fellow at TechNet. And I wanted to ask, since the topic is about work, what would your advice be to young people as they prepare to enter the workforce on how to, or what skills should they acquire? What should they study in school? How should young people look to the future and prepare for a future where our economy is transformed by AI?
I'll start with a glib answer, but I think there's some truth to it. So I am a proud graduate of a small liberal arts college, right? Learn how to think, and then you get dropped in a situation and you have to think your way through it. And so one of the things I think a lot about is that critical thinking. What do we depend on humans to do, and what are we looking for in terms of empathy and making decisions and judgment and context specific, et cetera. So I'm just going to put a plug in there for a broad-based liberal arts education, perhaps delivered to you by by Gen AI. But no, I mean, this is taking up a lot of airspace, I think, for parents and any of us also thinking about building businesses in this economy. I'll just say this job, I didn't know this job existed 10 years ago. I think the pace is moving faster for people, but it's going to, the skills that are relevant today will continue to be relevant tomorrow, and that is critical thinking, the idea of empathy and being able to sort of think about the next steps, et cetera. But I'm curious from a transformation perspective.
Yeah, that is tricky because I've had the 4 different degrees, so I'm not sure I'm the the example. Look, there is always going to be a need for STEM. I mean, people say, oh, in the future we will not need technology degrees. We will need technology degrees. STEM is going to be super important. Will continue to be important. It's just more and more because AI is becoming so pervasive. You will see a rebalancing between social sciences and technology, science, technology, STEM-related topics, right? So disciplines like behavioral economics are going to be more and more critical. Psychology, more and more critical. So not because they weren't important, but because of the needs out there of STEM talent were so big, there was a push of the society, of the parents, of the schools towards them. So now I think we are going to a much healthier age of companies, society appreciating all spectrums of talent, going from the creative and liberal arts and social sciences to a much more technical degrees. I do believe, though, no matter what you do, whether it's a major and minor, your major or minor needs to be STEM related. And the other could be anything, but you need to have some type of predisposition in technology and STEM.
Yeah, and I would just underscore that as well. I think that, there's a lot of emphasis on STEM education, but I think if it's possible, do both, right? I think a liberal arts education is as equally important as a STEM education because as these tools are developing, as there's increasing innovation, we're still going to need to think about how this technology impacts people at a human level, right? So, it's not just about how can we build the technology, how can we be innovative, but also how is this actually going to impact people, right? What are the ethical and political implications of these technologies as well? And so I think we're going to need people to be able to think about these technologies from both perspectives.
We are almost out of time, so I'm going to end on one quick question that I want to hear from each of you, which is, if we were to get together at State of the Net 2026, a year from now, what is the technology or the issue at kind of this intersection of AI and work that you think we're all going to be talking about and grappling with?
Just really quickly, I would say, and Athena already mentioned it, but AI agents, right? Like agents are going to be the next thing that is going to be a household conversation, just like generative AI is. So I think we're going to see a lot more people having conversations about personalizing AI tools and how they can apply it to not just their personal lives, but their work life as well.
On top of what you said, which is one, physical AI. We see the research is becoming more mature. I think we were discussing about humanoids for decades. They are coming to life very quickly, especially sectors like manufacturing, auto. We are testing, we are starting to test. 2026 will be a year that we, with our industry, will comfortably say this is going to be a game changer for how we further take manufacturing and manufacturing, I don't know, X.0, whatever that might be. So I'm really curious to see kind of what the results will show in 2026, of course, on top of the AI agent framework that is scaling.
Yes, yes. And just, I think because I have to have an answer, multi-agents, so multi-agentics. We are at the point, getting to the point where we can simulate entire populations based on very smart descriptions and data, et cetera. So what does that mean for a workplace? What does it mean for an industry? Are we going to have pollsters anymore? I know that we're not particularly caring about one section in particular, but that's something I think that will come to the fore in the next year. And from a policy perspective, what does that mean and what does that mean in the workplace?
Well, I think we solved it.
Yeah.
I think we're good, right? We
UBI?
fixed it. No more questions to ask here. No, listen, I can't thank our panelists enough for sharing their knowledge with us. I think we probably will be having this conversation again next year because it's not going anywhere. But thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you so